The sky was an unnatural shade of crimson that morning, as if the sun had forgotten how to rise properly. In the silence of the deserted street, a single black envelope lay on the doorstep of every house, each one addressed in an elegant, unfamiliar script. No one had seen who delivered them, and no one knew why they had arrived. But as the curious neighbors hesitated before picking them up, a quiet dread began to settle over the town. What could possibly be inside those mysterious letters that had appeared overnight without a trace? The idea of a global minimum tax on billionaires has gained traction in recent years, primarily as a means to address income inequality and raise public revenues. Proponents argue that billionaires, due to their immense wealth, should contribute more to society, particularly in addressing pressing global challenges like climate change, poverty, and infrastructure development. However, while these intentions are noble, the implementation of a global minimum tax on billionaires is fundamentally flawed. It is not only unfair but also potentially harmful to the global economy. Undermining national sovereignty. One of the most significant issues with a global minimum tax on billionaires is that it undermines national sovereignty. Taxation has traditionally been a sovereign right of nations, reflecting their unique social, economic, and political circumstances. Imposing a global tax framework infringes upon this sovereignty by dictating uniform tax policies that may not align with a country's specific needs or priorities. For instance, developing nations may prioritize attracting foreign investment over higher tax revenues, which could be crucial for their economic growth. A global minimum tax would force these countries to adhere to tax standards that might discourage billionaire investments, thereby stunting their economic development. Moreover, this one-size-fits-all approach fails to consider the diversity of economic systems, legal frameworks, and cultural values across different countries. Such a tax regime could be viewed as a form of economic imperialism, where wealthier nations impose their tax policies on less developed ones, exacerbating global inequalities rather than alleviating them. Capital flight and tax evasion. A global minimum tax on billionaires could lead to significant capital flight and increased tax evasion. Billionaires, unlike average citizens, have the means and resources to move their assets across borders to more favorable tax jurisdictions. This mobility means that attempts to impose a global tax could backfire, with billionaires simply relocating their wealth to countries that either refuse to enforce the tax or offer loopholes within the global framework. The result would be a race to the bottom, where countries compete to attract billionaire capital by offering lower taxes and more lenient regulations. This situation would not only undermine the effectiveness of the global minimum tax, but could also destabilize global financial markets as large sums of money are rapidly moved across borders. Additionally, increased efforts to evade taxation would likely lead to a rise in complex financial instruments and offshore structures, making it even more challenging for governments to track and tax wealth effectively. This would require significant resources to monitor and enforce, potentially outweighing the benefits of the tax itself. Discouraging innovation and entrepreneurship. Billionaires are often the product of successful entrepreneurship and innovation. Many of them have accumulated their wealth by creating companies that provide goods, services, and employment to millions of people worldwide. A global minimum tax on billionaires could discourage this entrepreneurial spirit by reducing the incentives for wealth creation. High taxation rates, especially when applied globally, could dissuade potential entrepreneurs from taking risks and investing in new ventures. The prospect of having a significant portion of their wealth taxed away could lead to a more risk-averse culture, where individuals are less willing to innovate and create new businesses. This would have a detrimental impact on the global economy, which relies on innovation and entrepreneurship to drive growth, create jobs, and improve living standards. Moreover, the narrative that billionaires should be taxed heavily because of their wealth overlooks the value they bring to society. Many billionaires reinvest their wealth into their businesses, fund philanthropic initiatives, and support economic development in their communities. By imposing a global minimum tax, we risk reducing the amount of capital available for these positive contributions, ultimately harming society rather than helping it. Complexity and implementation challenges. Implementing a global minimum tax on billionaires would be an extraordinarily complex undertaking. Tax systems around the world vary widely in terms of structure, enforcement capabilities, and legal frameworks. Coordinating a global tax policy that is fair, effective, and enforceable would require unprecedented levels of international cooperation and harmonization of tax laws. The logistical challenges alone are daunting. Countries would need to agree on a standardized definition of what constitutes a billionaire, which assets should be taxed, and at what rate. There would also need to be mechanisms in place to prevent double taxation, ensure compliance, and resolve disputes between countries. Given the diversity of tax systems and the differing economic interests of nations, reaching such an agreement would be highly unlikely. Even if a consensus were reached, enforcing the tax would be another major challenge. Many billionaires have complex, opaque financial structures that span multiple jurisdictions, making it difficult to assess their true wealth. Tracking and taxing this wealth would require significant resources and could lead to a proliferation of legal challenges as billionaires and their advisors seek to minimize their tax liabilities. The costs of implementing and enforcing a global minimum tax could easily outweigh the benefits, making the entire endeavor economically unviable. Unintended consequences on global economy. The introduction of a global minimum tax on billionaires could have unintended consequences that negatively impact the global economy. For instance, billionaires might respond to higher taxes by reducing their investments in key sectors such as technology, healthcare, and infrastructure. These sectors are often the engines of economic growth and job creation, and a reduction in investment could slow down innovation and economic progress. Furthermore, billionaires might choose to shift their investments towards less productive but tax-efficient assets, such as art, collectibles, or real estate, rather than funding new businesses or technologies. This could lead to asset bubbles in certain markets and reduce the overall efficiency of capital allocation in the economy. The distortion of investment incentives would ultimately harm economic growth, leading to lower productivity, fewer jobs, and reduced income levels for the broader population. There is also the risk that a global minimum tax on billionaires could trigger a global recession. If billionaires decide to withdraw their investments from countries with high tax rates, it could lead to capital shortages, reduced economic activity, and job losses. This would be particularly devastating for emerging economies that rely heavily on foreign investment to fuel their growth. The ripple effects of such a withdrawal could lead to a downturn in global trade and economic activity, plunging the world into a prolonged economic slump. Ethical concerns and fairness. While proponents of a global minimum tax on billionaires argue that it is a matter of fairness, the reality is more complex. Taxation is fundamentally about balancing the needs of society with the rights of individuals. Imposing a punitive tax on billionaires simply because they have been successful raises ethical concerns about the role of government in redistributing wealth. There is a danger that such a tax could be perceived as penalizing success and achievement. Billionaires, like all individuals, have the right to enjoy the fruits of their labor and ingenuity. While it is reasonable to expect them to contribute to society through taxes, a global minimum tax that specifically targets them could be seen as unfairly singling them out for punishment. This could foster resentment and division within society, as people begin to see wealth as something to be punished rather than celebrated. Moreover, there is the question of what constitutes a fair share of taxes. Billionaires already contribute significant amounts in taxes, both directly and indirectly. They pay income taxes, capital gains taxes, and corporate taxes, and their spending generates sales taxes and VAT. Additionally, many billionaires engage in philanthropy, donating large sums to charitable causes. Imposing a global minimum tax on top of these contributions raises questions about how much is too much and whether it is fair to ask billionaires to bear an even greater burden. Alternatives to a global minimum tax. Rather than imposing a global minimum tax on billionaires, there are alternative approaches that could achieve the desired outcomes of reducing inequality and raising public revenues without the negative consequences discussed above. For example, countries could focus on closing loopholes in their existing tax systems that allow billionaires to avoid paying their fair share of taxes. This would be a more targeted and effective way of ensuring that billionaires contribute to society without resorting to punitive measures. Governments could also promote voluntary philanthropy and encourage billionaires to invest in social causes through tax incentives and public recognition. Many billionaires are already deeply committed to philanthropy and would likely respond positively to incentives that encourage them to do more. This approach would harness the power of private wealth for public good without the need for heavy-handed government intervention. Additionally, countries could collaborate on international agreements to prevent tax evasion and ensure that billionaires pay taxes where they earn their income. Such agreements could focus on sharing information and coordinating tax policies across borders, making it more difficult for billionaires to evade taxes while still respecting national sovereignty. Final thoughts: while the idea of a global minimum tax on billionaires is appealing in theory, it is fraught with practical, ethical, and economic challenges. Such a tax would undermine national sovereignty, encourage capital flight and tax evasion, discourage innovation and entrepreneurship, and create significant implementation challenges. Moreover, it could have unintended consequences that harm the global economy and raise serious ethical concerns about fairness. Rather than pursuing a global minimum tax, governments should focus on closing existing tax loopholes, promoting voluntary philanthropy, and enhancing international cooperation to prevent tax evasion. These approaches would be more effective in achieving the goals of reducing inequality and raising public revenues without the negative side effects associated with a global minimum tax on billionaires. In conclusion, while the desire to address global inequality is commendable, a global minimum tax on billionaires is not the right solution. It is a policy that is unfair, economically harmful, and fraught with practical difficulties. Instead, we should seek alternative approaches that balance the need for social justice with the principles of fairness, economic growth, and national sovereignty.